The weight of judgment. The air in the courtroom was thick with quiet tension, heavy with the kind of silence that made the walls feel like they were closing in. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a sterile, artificial glow over everything. But no amount of light could warm the cold atmosphere that Judge Samuel Hargrove carried with him like a storm cloud. At the defendant's table sat Angela Carter, a single black mother in her late 30s, her hands clasped tightly together as she stared at the polished wood of the table. Her breath came in slow, controlled draws, but inside, her heart pounded like a drum. Beside her, gripping her hand tightly, was Jordan, her 9-year-old son. His deep brown eyes darted around the courtroom, taking in everything, the way children do when they know something serious is happening but don't quite understand the full extent of it. Angela wasn't a criminal. She wasn't some repeat offender. She was just a woman trying to survive in a system that was built like a maze, full of dead ends for people like her. A few unpaid parking tickets, late fees piling on top of late fees, and suddenly, what should have been a minor inconvenience had turned into a mountain too steep to climb. Across from them, Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his expression one of calculated indifference. He had seen hundreds, maybe thousands of cases like this before, and he had already decided the outcome before Angela had even spoken a word. His fingers drummed against the desk, a small smirk curling on his lips as he flipped through her case file. "Well, well, well, Miss Carter," he drawled, his tone thick with something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't far from condescension either. "Here we are again. Another single mother who thinks the rules don't apply to her." Angela stiffened. She wasn't here again. This was her first time standing before him, but she had heard the stories. Other mothers, other fathers, other people of color who had walked into this courtroom expecting justice and had instead received nothing but shame. Jordan squeezed her hand, his small fingers tightening around hers. "Your Honor, I don't think you understand," Angela started, keeping her voice even polite. "I've been working 2 jobs, and Judge Hargrove cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I do understand. I hear the same thing every week. You people always have an excuse." The word slammed into Angela like a punch to the gut. You people. She saw it in the way his lips curled, in the way his eyes flicked over her before settling back on the paperwork, as if the decision had already been made, and she was just wasting his time. Jordan stiffened beside her. Angela took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I wasn't ignoring the tickets. I had to make a choice between paying them and keeping my son fed. I don't have the luxury of extra money. I was planning on paying them, but—" Judge Hargrove chuckled, a short, cruel sound that made the hairs on Angela's arms rise. "Miss Carter, do you hear yourself?" he said, shaking his head. "You're telling me that you had to choose between following the law and taking care of your own responsibilities. That's what's wrong with people like you. Always blaming the system instead of taking responsibility." The humiliation burned in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She would not break down in front of this man. "Your Honor," she tried again, keeping her voice steady. "I work from 5 in the morning to midnight. I barely get any sleep. I'm sure you have a very tragic story," he interrupted, waving her off as he reached for his gavel. "But this court is about the law, not sob stories. You owe the fines. Either you pay today, or I issue a warrant for your arrest." Angela's breath hitched. A warrant. Her vision swam. Who would take care of Jordan if she was arrested? Jordan's hand slipped from hers, and suddenly, he spoke. "That's not fair," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Judge Hargrove's hand froze over the gavel. His eyes snapped to the boy, as if just now registering his presence. "What did you just say?" the judge asked, his voice dripping with the same arrogance as before. Jordan didn't flinch. He didn't stammer or look away. His small hands balled into fists on his lap, his deep brown eyes locking onto the judge's with a quiet fury. "I said, that's not fair. You're not even listening to my mom. You don't care what she's saying. You just want to make her feel bad. Angela's heart nearly stopped. This was not how things were supposed to go. This was not how you spoke to a judge. The court clerk, who had been scribbling away, froze mid-sentence. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, suddenly interested in the exchange. Judge Hargrove blinked, stunned into silence for just a second, before his face twisted into irritation. "Young man, you don't speak in my courtroom unless spoken to." Jordan didn't back down. "You didn't let my mom speak," he countered. Angela gripped his wrist in silent warning. But it was too late. Jordan was not stopping. "You said she's not responsible," he continued, his voice sharp with emotion. "But you don't even know her. You don't know how hard she works. You don't know that she wakes up before the sun just to get to her first job and comes home late after her second one. You don't know that she was late on those tickets because she had to choose between paying them and buying food for me." His voice wavered for the first time, but still, he did not back down. Angela felt her breath catch. This was a 9-year-old boy speaking like a man, speaking like someone who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Hargrove's smirk twitched, but he was no longer smiling. His fingers tightened around the gavel. "That's enough," he said, his voice sharp, commanding. Jordan did not flinch. "You don't like us, do you?" he asked suddenly. Angela gasped. Judge Hargrove's expression darkened. "Excuse me." "You don't like people like us," Jordan said, his voice eerily calm now. "That's why you talk to my mom like that. That's why you laugh when she explains why she's here. Because you don't see us as real people." The judge's fingers twitched. His face turned red, but he did not speak. Jordan tilted his head. "You think my mom is lazy. You think she's just another person who doesn't follow the rules. But you don't know anything about us." Judge Hargrove exhaled sharply, his composure cracking. "Your Honor," Angela finally managed to say, her voice trembling, her heart pounding in her ears. "He's just a child." Judge Hargrove turned to Angela. But something was different now. He was looking at her, but not the way he had before. Not with indifference. With something else. Something almost like doubt. Jordan wasn't done. "You talk about responsibility, but what about yours?" he asked. "You get to decide people's lives every day. You have all the power here. So why do you use it to make people feel small?" A heavy silence settled in the courtroom. For the first time in years, Judge Hargrove did not have an answer. A child's truth, a judge's silence. The courtroom remained frozen in silence. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a dull glow over the polished wood and worn-out faces. Judge Samuel Hargrove sat stiffly in his chair, gripping his gavel as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Across from him, at the defendant's table, Angela Carter sat rigid, her hands clenched together, her heart pounding like a war drum. And beside her stood Jordan, a 9-year-old boy who had just shattered the illusion of power in this courtroom. Judge Hargrove had sentenced thousands of people before. He had broken spirits, sent men and women away in cuffs, and reduced desperate pleas to background noise. He had thrived in this role, reveling in the control it granted him over others. But never in all his years had a child looked him in the eye and spoken the truth so plainly, without fear. Jordan's small hands were clenched at his sides, his brown eyes locked onto the judge's. "You get to decide people's lives every day," Jordan had said. "You have all the power here. So why do you use it to make people feel small?" The words still hung in the air, thick and unshakable. The court clerk had stopped writing. The bailiff, once uninterested, now watched with silent curiosity. Even the empty seats in the courtroom seemed to be holding their breath. Angela wanted to pull her son back, to tell him that standing up to a man like this was dangerous, that this wasn't how the world worked, but something inside her told her to let him speak. Because for the first time in this entire hearing, someone was finally listening. A judge unraveled. Judge Hargrove's nostrils flared, his lips pressed into a thin line. Boy, I suggest you sit down before you get your mother into more trouble. Jordan didn't move. You're mad, Jordan said plainly, tilting his head slightly. Not because I'm wrong, but because I'm right. Angela squeezed her son's hand. Jordan. But he didn't stop. He wasn't scared. You said my mom isn't responsible, Jordan continued, his voice calm but sharp. You said she makes bad choices, but what bad choices did she make? She works 2 jobs. She makes sure I eat. She's the reason I have clothes, the reason I have a place to sleep. The only reason she couldn't pay your parking tickets was because she had to choose between paying them or making sure I don't go to school hungry. He took a step forward, his small frame standing firm against the towering bench where Judge Hargrove sat. You act like the law is always fair, but it's not. You don't even care why my mom couldn't pay. You just want to make her feel bad for it. Judge Hargrove scoffed, shaking his head, as if trying to dismiss the words before they could sink in. You don't understand how the world works, boy, he said, though his voice wasn't as sharp as before. Life is tough. It doesn't care about feelings. Your mother broke the law. That's the only thing that matters. Jordan's gaze didn't waver. But you don't treat everyone the same, do you? The judge's fingers twitched on his desk. What did you just say? Jordan swallowed, but he didn't back down. I bet if we were different, you wouldn't talk like this. I bet if my mom was sitting here, but she wasn't black, you'd listen to her. Angela inhaled sharply. Oh God, Jordan. Judge Hargrove's face darkened. His grip on the gavel tightened. Watch yourself, young man. But Jordan wasn't done. You don't even know my mom's name without looking at that paper, he said. You don't know what it's like to be tired all the time, to work so hard and still not have enough. You don't know what it's like to have to choose which bills you can afford to pay. You've never had to make those choices, so you don't care about people who do. His voice softened, but his words hit harder. I feel bad for you. Judge Hargrove blinked, caught off guard. What? Jordan let out a small sigh. I feel bad for you. Because you don't even know how unfair you are. Angela could feel the shift in the room. The judge, who had walked into this courtroom so sure of himself, so certain of his power, now looked deeply unsettled. The breaking point. Judge Hargrove's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, wanted to dismiss the child before him, but something held him back. Because deep down, he knew the boy was right. For years, he had thought of himself as the enforcer of justice. He believed the people who stood before him were where they were because of their own failures, their own mistakes. But now he wasn't so sure. Because Jordan wasn't afraid of him. Because Jordan wasn't just throwing around accusations. Because Jordan wasn't angry. He was disappointed. Judge Hargrove's fingers tapped against the desk as he exhaled through his nose. He turned back to Angela, who sat perfectly still, waiting, watching. His voice came out lower this time, less certain. Ms. Carter. He cleared his throat, glancing at the paperwork before him, though he suddenly felt like it meant nothing. He stopped. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. Jordan tilted his head slightly. Are you going to do better? Judge Hargrove stiffened. Excuse me. Jordan shrugged. Are you going to keep making people like my mom feel small? Or are you going to start listening? A painful silence followed. Angela did not breathe. The courtroom was no longer under Judge Hargrove's control. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one delivering the judgment. He was the one receiving it. His whole life, he had prided himself on being fair, on being tough but just. But now, looking at Angela, looking at Jordan, he realized something. He wasn't just. He was angry. Not just at the people who stood before him, but at the world. At his own past. At the struggles he had endured. At the fact that he had once been powerless too. And at some point, somewhere along the way, he had become the very thing he once hated. Judge Hargrove swallowed hard, setting his gavel down. His hands felt suddenly heavy. He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "This court is adjourned," he said. "Miss Carter, you're free to go." Angela's eyes widened. "Wait. What?" Jordan blinked. Even he wasn't expecting that. The judge rubbed his temples. "Your fines are dismissed." His voice was softer now. "Go home." Angela felt tears burn behind her eyes. Jordan, still watching the judge carefully, finally nodded. Judge Hargrove sat there, silent, as Angela stood, guiding her son toward the exit. But as they reached the door, Jordan turned back one last time. And the last thing Judge Hargrove saw before they walked out wasn't defiance. It was hope. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he deserved it. The reflection of a judge. Judge Samuel Hargrove sat motionless at his bench long after the courtroom had emptied. The gavel, his symbol of power, lay untouched beside his wrinkled case files. The chair beneath him, once a throne of unquestionable authority, now felt like a prison. For years, he had presided over thousands of cases, issuing rulings without hesitation. The law was the law. That was the justification he had always given himself. But today, something had changed. A 9-year-old boy had stood before him, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous. Disappointment. Jordan Carter had stared him in the eye and asked a question that refused to leave his mind. "Are you going to do better?" The judge clenched his jaw, fingers drumming lightly against the desk. The words should have been easy to dismiss, but they weren't. They had dug deep, settling into the cracks of his carefully built walls. He had expected anger. He had expected fear. But the boy had shown neither. He had forced him to look inward, and Judge Hargrove wasn't sure he liked what he saw. Memories of a different man. The office was dimly lit, the glow from a single desk lamp casting long shadows along the wood-paneled walls. Judge Hargrove sat behind his cluttered desk, a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand. For the first time in decades, he felt exposed. His eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the shelf, a picture of a much younger man in a graduation gown. The face in the photo was his, though it barely resembled the man he had become. Back then, he had been hungry, not for power, not for control, but for something greater: change. He had grown up poor, dirt poor, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. He had spent nights doing homework by candlelight, had gone to school hungry more times than he could count. He had sworn, once upon a time, that when he made something of himself, he would help people like his mother. What happened to that man? When had he become so cold? When had he started seeing people as problems instead of stories? Hargrove exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Angela Carter's case. Jordan's words. They had stripped away his excuses, peeling him back layer by layer until there was nothing left to hide behind. Was he really the villain? Had he spent years sentencing others without ever realizing he was the one who meted judgment? His throat tightened. He didn't like the answer. Because deep down, he already knew it. A visit from the past. A sudden knock on his office door made him jolt upright. "Come in," he called, clearing his throat, forcing himself back into the role of authority. The door opened, and to his surprise, it was Judge Rebecca Owens. "Sam," she greeted, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she carried herself with the air of someone who had seen too much, but still managed to keep her heart intact. Hargrove sighed. "Rebecca, it's late. What brings you here?" She folded her arms, studying him with knowing eyes. "I heard what happened in your courtroom today." He stiffened. "Oh." She nodded. "The entire courthouse is talking about it. Apparently, a 9-year-old put you on trial instead of the other way around." Hargrove scoffed, reaching for his scotch. "Is that what they're saying?" Rebecca sat across from him, her gaze sharp yet unreadable. "It's not just what they're saying, Sam. It's the truth, isn't it?" He opened his mouth, but no words came. Because she was right. She leaned forward. "I've known you a long time. I remember when you first got your robe. You wanted to change things. You wanted to be different." Hargrove let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, well, life has a funny way of breaking people." "Only if you let it," she countered. A heavy pause followed. Rebecca sighed, leaning back. "Sam, what happened today wasn't just some kid getting lucky with his words. He saw something in you that you've been trying to ignore for years." "And what's that?" She met his gaze. "That you're not the man you think you are." His grip tightened around the glass. "So what, Rebecca? You expect me to just change overnight? To undo years off?" "No," she interrupted gently. "But I expect you to at least try." He exhaled sharply. "Even if I wanted to, where would I even start?" She smiled faintly. "By answering his question." Hargrove frowned. "What question?" Rebecca stood, smoothing out her robe. "Are you going to do better?" She didn't wait for a response. Instead, she walked to the door, pausing briefly before stepping out. "You have a choice, Sam," she said over her shoulder. "You can keep pretending today didn't happen, or you can start being the man you used to be." And with that, she was gone. Hargrove stared at the empty doorway, his thoughts louder than ever. A new kind of judgment. For the first time in his career, Judge Samuel Hargrove found himself standing in an unfamiliar courtroom. Not as a judge, but as a listener. It was a small community center, the kind he had passed by hundreds of times without a second glance. The walls were lined with bulletin boards covered in local events, support group meetings, and resources for struggling families. At the front of the room, a group of parents sat in a circle, sharing their experiences, their frustrations, their fears. They were mothers like Angela Carter, fathers trying to provide, people not looking for a handout, but for a fair chance. Hargrove stood near the back, silent, watching, listening. And then, a familiar voice spoke. "Some of us don't get to choose between breaking the law and survival. Some of us have to pick which bills we can afford to pay. And sometimes we make choices that aren't about ignoring the law, but about keeping our families fed." Angela Carter. Hargrove's stomach twisted. She hadn't seen him yet, hadn't noticed the man who had once judged her so harshly now standing in the shadows. But as he listened, as he truly listened, he realized something. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to learn. For the first time, Judge Hargrove wasn't passing judgment. He was finally facing his own. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward doing better. The judge steps down. Judge Samuel Hargrove had never felt out of place before. Not in his courtroom, not in the judicial halls, not even in the private clubs where other judges gathered to pat each other on the back for upholding the law. But here, he felt like a stranger. The community center was nothing like the grand courthouse he had ruled over for decades. The floors were scuffed, the chairs mismatched, and the air carried the scent of cheap coffee and old books. And yet, it felt more real than anywhere he had been in years. At the front of the room, a group of parents sat in a loose circle. Some clutched their children close. Others sat with tired shoulders, their eyes heavy with exhaustion but filled with a quiet resilience. These were the people he had sentenced. Not criminals, not dangers to society, but parents, workers, survivors. And in the center of it all, speaking with a strength that made even Hargrove hesitate, was Angela Carter, a judge without power. Angela's voice carried through the small room, steady but firm. "I stood in that courtroom because of a few unpaid parking tickets," she said, her hands resting protectively on Jordan's shoulders. "And I was treated like a criminal, like I wasn't even a person." Murmurs of agreement spread through the group. Hargrove swallowed hard, shifting his weight. He had come here out of some need he didn't fully understand yet, an urge that had been gnawing at him ever since Jordan had confronted him. But now, standing in the back of the room, hearing his own actions described through the voices of those he had judged, he wanted to disappear. Angela continued, "I worked 2 jobs. I take care of my son. But that didn't matter to the judge who looked at me that day. She shook her head, her eyes darkening. All he saw was someone to punish. Hargrove felt the weight of every word, because she was talking about him. He clenched his fists. Why was he even here? What did he expect? A chance to defend himself, to explain why he did what he did. What would he even say? That the law is blind, that he was just doing his job. Even he didn't believe that anymore. Because if the law were truly blind, why did it only seem to come down hardest on people like Angela Carter? The people in the room weren't looking for sympathy. They weren't even looking for justice. They just wanted to be seen. And for the first time in his entire career, Samuel Hargrove forced himself to see them. A familiar voice. A small hand went up. Jordan. Hargrove inhaled sharply. Why do people like us always have to fight harder just to be treated the same? The boy asked, his voice clear and unwavering. The room fell into silence. Angela placed a hand on her son's back. Baby. No, Jordan said. I want to know. Hargrove felt the entire room shift toward him. Angela followed Jordan's gaze. And then she saw him. Her eyes widened slightly, her body tensing, but she didn't look afraid. She looked curious, as if wondering why a man like him would dare to stand in a place like this. He hadn't expected to be noticed. He had planned to listen and leave. But now, as every set of eyes turned to him, he realized he had no choice. Jordan's words still rang in the air. Why do people like us always have to fight harder just to be treated the same? It was the kind of question that demanded an answer. And for the first time in his life, Judge Samuel Hargrove didn't have one. The fall of a gavel. A younger version of himself would have walked away, would have dismissed the question the same way he had dismissed countless defendants in his courtroom. But the boy who had challenged him in that courtroom, the boy who had seen through him, wasn't going to let him go so easily. So Hargrove did something he had never done before. He stepped forward. A few people murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Others stiffened. Angela's expression remained unreadable. Jordan did not flinch. You want an answer, Hargrove said finally, his voice lower than usual. Jordan nodded. You shouldn't have to fight harder, Hargrove admitted. But you do. Because the world isn't fair. He looked around at the gathered faces, the parents, the workers, the survivors of a system that had never been built to protect them. And people like me, he continued, voice bitter, made it that way. Angela blinked, clearly taken aback. A few in the room exchanged surprised glances. But Jordan? He just stared, waiting. Hargrove let out a long, sharp breath. I sat in that courtroom for years, thinking I was upholding justice, that if people struggled, it was because they didn't work hard enough. That if they were in my courtroom, it was because they deserved to be there. His jaw tightened, but I was wrong. The room was dead silent. I spent years judging people before they even spoke, Hargrove admitted, rubbing his temples. I thought I was fair. I thought I was enforcing the law. But I was enforcing my version of it, the version that told me people like you were just another case file, another problem to be handled. He clenched his fists. And then, one day, a kid walked into my courtroom and called me out on it. Jordan's lips parted slightly, his fingers curling over the arm of his chair. You told me I didn't see your mom as a person, Hargrove said, looking directly at the boy. And you were right. I didn't. Angela inhaled sharply. Hargrove's voice grew rough. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I needed to come here, to see for myself what I had ignored for years, to hear what I never let people say in my courtroom. He let out a slow breath. I came here to tell you that you were right, Jordan, he admitted. And I came here to ask. He hesitated. What do I do now? Angela stared. Jordan's fingers relaxed. The tension in the room shifted into something else. A quiet, heavy understanding. For the first time in his life, Samuel Hargrove wasn't holding the gavel. And for the first time, he was ready to listen. A new kind of sentence. The weight of his confession hung in the air. Angela was the first to speak. "Change doesn't start with a speech, Your Honor." He flinched at the title. He wasn't sure if he even deserved it anymore. She studied him carefully before continuing. "If you're serious about this, don't just listen tonight and go back to business as usual tomorrow." She nodded toward the room. "Come back. Keep listening. Get involved. See us as more than just cases." Hargrove exhaled slowly. He had spent decades thinking his rulings were final. But tonight, he realized something. His own sentence had just begun. The weight of change. Judge Samuel Hargrove sat in the folding chair at the community center, the same man he had always been, yet entirely different. For the first time in years, he wasn't presiding over anyone's fate. No bailiff stood at his side. No court clerk scribbled his words into legal records. No defendants waited anxiously for his judgment. Here, he was just another man. And the people around him, they weren't criminals. They weren't problems to be solved. They were human beings. Angela Carter's words still echoed in his mind. "If you're serious about this, don't just listen tonight and go back to business as usual tomorrow. Come back. Keep listening. Get involved. See us as more than just cases." For the first time in his career, someone had told him what to do, and he was willing to listen. The first question. Angela shifted in her seat, watching him closely, arms folded across her chest. "Let me ask you something, Judge Hargrove." He winced at the title but didn't correct her. "You've been sitting on that bench for what? 20 years. 26, he admitted. Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. "And in those 26 years, how many people have you sentenced to jail for not being able to afford a fine?" Hargrove exhaled slowly. He didn't want to answer, because he already knew the number was too high. Too many single mothers. Too many fathers who had missed child support payments because they had to choose between rent and food. Too many kids who had grown up with their parents behind bars for something that should have never landed them there in the first place. He met Angela's gaze, more than I care to admit. A murmur ran through the room. Someone let out a bitter chuckle. Angela shook her head. "So now you're here. What exactly do you want?" Hargrove swallowed. He had asked himself the same question before walking in here. "I want to know what I can do," he admitted, "not as a judge. As a man." Angela tilted her head, studying him. Jordan, sitting beside her, remained silent but alert. The same boy who had looked at him with disappointment in the courtroom was watching him now, measuring his words carefully. A man at the far end of the room, a heavy-set man in a mechanic's uniform, spoke up. "You really expect us to believe that?" He scoffed. "That a judge, a man who's been throwing us in jail for years, woke up one morning and decided he cares?" Hargrove sighed. "I didn't wake up and decide anything." He rubbed his temples. "A 9-year-old boy called me out in front of an entire courtroom. And I realized something." The room waited. Hargrove looked at Jordan. "I realized that for years I was looking down at people who had been through the same struggles I went through, and I treated them as if their suffering was a choice." A few people shifted in their seats. Some nodded. Others still watched him with deep skepticism. Angela scoffed softly. "So now that you've had your grand realization, what happens next?" Hargrove leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's what I came here to ask." The trial of a judge. For the next hour, Hargrove didn't speak. He listened. People spoke of their struggles. A young mother, barely in her 20s, described how she had been arrested for driving with a suspended license, a license that had been taken away because she couldn't afford a traffic ticket. A man who had worked 30 years in a factory explained how one missed court date, because he had to cover a shift, had resulted in a bench warrant. A father told a story of being pulled over for a broken taillight and ending up in jail for unpaid fines, losing his job, his car, and nearly his home in the process. Hargrove listened to them all. Each story chipped away at the image he had of himself, the man who had believed in justice, who had believed that his courtroom was fair. Now he saw the truth. His courtroom had never been fair. It had been a trap, and he had been the one tightening the chains. The words sat heavily on his chest as the stories continued, each one a quiet confession of a system that had long since stopped protecting the people it claimed to serve. By the time the last speaker finished, the room was exhausted. Angela sighed, running a hand through her hair. "So, Judge Hargrove, you wanted to listen. You wanted to learn." He nodded, his throat dry. "I did." She leaned back in her chair. "Then tell us, what do you plan to do about it?" A different kind of judgment. Hargrove let the question settle. What could he do? He couldn't undo decades of damage. He couldn't erase the sentences he had handed down. But he could start now. He sat up straighter. "First, I'm going to review every case I can, every fine I ever handed out, every sentence I ever issued. If there's a way to overturn unfair rulings, I'll find it." Angela raised an eyebrow. "And," Hargrove inhaled deeply, "and I'm stepping down from the bench." Gasps rippled through the room. Jordan's eyes widened. Even Angela's posture stiffened. The mechanic from earlier let out a low whistle. "Dan." Angela folded her arms. "And then what?" Hargrove exhaled sharply. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I know that I need to be part of the solution." He looked around the room. "I need to make sure that judges who come after me don't repeat my mistakes, that the next person in my seat sees people, not just cases." Angela studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, just once. "Good," she said, "because we need all the help we can get." The beginning of something new. Hargrove left the community center that night feeling lighter, but also heavier. Because now, for the first time in his career, he wasn't just walking out of a courtroom. He was walking into a new kind of trial. One where the verdict wouldn't be handed down in a day, where change wouldn't come with a single ruling. But he was ready. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't hiding behind the gavel. He was standing beside the people he had once judged. And that was justice. A judge without a gavel. Judge Samuel Hargrove had never seen his office so empty. The shelves that once held stacks of law books, thick with precedent and authority, were now bare. The framed certificates that had once declared his power over justice lay face down in a cardboard box. The desk that had, for decades, been his throne, a place where he had ruled over the fates of thousands, felt nothing more than a polished wooden slab. Because today, for the first time in 26 years, Judge Hargrove was no longer a judge. He had resigned. His colleagues had been stunned. Some had laughed, assuming it was a temporary moment of self-doubt. Others had shaken their heads, telling him he was making a mistake. But Samuel Hargrove knew the truth. The mistake had been the last 26 years of his rulings. The mistake had been believing that justice was black and white, that poverty was a choice, that punishment was the same as accountability. Now he was free. Freed from the illusion that he had ever been delivering true justice. But freedom came with a new weight, because now he had to figure out what to do next. Reckoning with his past. The courthouse hallways were familiar, too familiar. Every echoing footstep reminded him of the thousands of people who had walked these floors before him, many of them leaving in cuffs, their lives forever changed by his decisions. As he passed the judge's chambers, he caught sight of Judge Rebecca Owens standing near the stairwell, arms crossed, watching him. "You really did it," she said, her voice carrying that same mix of amusement and quiet approval she always had. He nodded. "Yeah." She studied him for a moment. "So, what now?" Hargrove let out a breath. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Rebecca smirked. "You realize most judges retire to golf courses and book clubs, right? Somehow, I don't think I'd fit in either." She gave a small chuckle before her expression turned more serious. "You're walking away from a lot, Sam. Power, prestige, influence. He nodded. I walked away from something I never should have had. Rebecca tilted her head. Then maybe you should start by using what you still do have. He frowned. And what's that? She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Knowledge, experience, and the credibility to challenge the system you upheld for decades. Hargrove's stomach tightened. Challenge the system. The very same system he had helped build. A mother's reluctant ally. Hargrove hadn't been back to the community center since that night he had admitted his failures. Now, standing outside its faded blue doors, he hesitated. Would they even want him here? Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and old paper filled the air. Folding chairs were arranged in circles again, though fewer people were there this time. And in the middle of it all sat Angela Carter. She glanced up as he walked in, her expression unreadable. But Jordan? Jordan grinned. Hargrove exhaled. He hadn't realized how much he had been dreading seeing disappointment in the boy's eyes. Angela, however, remained cautious. You again, she said, arms folded. Didn't expect to see you back here. I didn't either, Hargrove admitted, running a hand over his tie. He hadn't even realized he was still dressed like a judge. Pressed suit, polished shoes. The uniform of a man who had once ruled from a high bench, now standing in front of people who had suffered because of it. Angela raised an eyebrow. You lost. No, he said, swallowing thickly. I came to help. Silence. Angela leaned back in her chair. And how exactly does a former judge plan to help a bunch of people who don't trust the system he spent years protecting? He expected resentment. What he hadn't expected was how much he agreed with her. Breaking the system from within. Hargrove sat down. For the next 2 hours, he listened again. But this time, he didn't just listen to their stories. He listened for solutions. And what he realized was both terrifying and obvious. Most of these people weren't criminals. They were victims, not of the law, but of a system that had turned minor infractions into life sentences. Unpaid tickets led to suspended licenses. Suspended licenses led to arrests. Arrests led to lost jobs. Lost jobs led to homelessness. It was a cycle, a machine. And for years, he had been the one pulling the levers. Angela noticed the shift in his expression. You look like you just figured something out. I think I did, he murmured. Angela sighed. Yeah, and what's that? He met her gaze. I didn't just judge cases. I enabled a system that profits off of poverty. Angela didn't say anything at first, but after a long moment she nodded. Yeah, you did. Hargrove exhaled. Then help me fix it. She blinked. What? I can't undo what I've done, he said, but I can use what I know to stop others from making the same mistakes. He leaned forward. I want to work with you, with this community, to expose the loopholes, to fight against the judges and policies that turn fines into jail sentences. Angela frowned, clearly skeptical. But Jordan? Jordan was grinning. You mean like a lawyer? The boy asked. Hargrove smirked. Something like that. Angela exhaled, rubbing her temple. You really expect me to trust you? No, he admitted. I expect you to hold me accountable. Another silence. Then, finally, Angela Carter extended her hand. Then welcome to the fight. Hargrove shook it. For the first time, he wasn't passing judgment. He was standing beside the people fighting for real justice. And this time, he was ready to learn. The trial of a broken system. Judge Samuel Hargrove sat in the back of a crowded municipal courtroom, watching another black mother stand before a judge who barely looked at her. Her voice trembled as she spoke, trying to explain why she hadn't paid her parking fines. The same excuse he had heard 1,000 times before. Except now, he knew it wasn't an excuse. It was survival. Hargrove had been this judge. Had sat in that very seat, gavel in hand, convinced that people like her were just careless, that they deserved to be there. Now he wanted to rip that gavel from the judge's hand and throw it through the window, because he knew what would happen next. The judge wouldn't listen. The fines would stack. And if she couldn't pay, jail. And the system would chew her up like it had so many others. But this time, she wasn't alone. Because Angela Carter was here. Because he was here. And this time, they were ready to fight. From judge to advocate, Angela sat beside him, arms crossed, her expression tight with anger. "She doesn't even have a lawyer," she muttered. Hargrove nodded, jaw clenched. "She doesn't stand a chance." Angela glanced at him. "So what are we going to do about it?" The "we" still felt strange to him. For so long, he had been the opposition, the man who sat above, passing sentence after sentence, never questioning whether the system was wrong. Now he was sitting beside the very people he had once condemned, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "We go after the system," he said, his voice firm. "We tear it down from the inside." Angela smirked. "Now you're speaking my language." A judge goes public. The courtroom doors swung open, and the woman, the defendant, was led away in cuffs, just like Angela had once feared for herself. Hargrove couldn't stand it. "We need to do something," he muttered. Angela raised an eyebrow. "You ready to start a war, Judge?" He exhaled. "I think I already did." That night, they called a press conference. For the first time, a former judge stood on the steps of a courthouse and admitted the system was broken. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in his face, and Samuel Hargrove told the truth. "I spent 26 years sitting on that bench," he said, voice steady, believing I was enforcing justice. But I wasn't. I was upholding a system designed to make money off of poverty, and I refused to be silent about it anymore. Gasps rippled through the reporters. Angela stood beside him, arms crossed, Jordan watching from the sidelines with the proudest look he had ever seen on a child. Hargrove met the cameras head-on. "The system needs to be exposed. It needs to be changed. And starting today, I will do everything in my power to make sure that happens." Reporters shouted questions. "Are you saying the justice system is corrupt? Do you regret your past rulings? What are you planning to do next?" Hargrove took a breath. "I'm planning to make things right. The battle begins." Hargrove didn't just talk. He acted. He partnered with activists, lawyers, and organizations working to fight against the predatory court fees that trapped people in endless cycles of debt. He dug through old case files, searching for people who had been unjustly jailed for fines they couldn't afford, and fought for their records to be cleared. He testified in hearings, exposing judges who handed out extreme sentences for minor infractions. And when his former colleagues turned on him, when they called him a traitor, when they told him he was disgracing his own legacy, he stood his ground. Because the truth was simple. His legacy wasn't justice. It had been oppression. And he wouldn't be that man anymore. The trial of Samuel Hargrove. Months passed. One night, he sat across from Angela and Jordan in the community center, his sleeves rolled up, exhaustion pulling at his features. "You're doing good work," Angela admitted, tapping her fingers against the table. Hargrove gave a tired chuckle. "You sure about that?" She smirked. "Don't get ahead of yourself. You've still got a long way to go." Jordan grinned. "But at least you're trying." Hargrove exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, trying." He hesitated. Then, quietly, he asked, "Do you think I'll ever be able to make up for what I did?" Angela was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "No." He flinched. But then she leaned forward. "But you can damn sure try. And that's what matters now." He swallowed, nodded, and in that moment, he realized. The greatest trial of his life wasn't one he had ever presided over. It was the one he was facing now. The trial of a man trying to fix what he had broken. The trial of Samuel Hargrove. And he was ready to fight it. A gavel no longer needed. 1 year later, the law changed. Legislation was passed, eliminating predatory fines and fees for minor infractions. Judges were held accountable for the rulings they handed down. Hargrove watched as policies he had once enforced were finally torn apart. Angela stood beside him as the news broke. "You actually did it," she muttered. "No," Hargrove corrected. "We did it." She smirked. "You're learning, Judge." Jordan, now 10 years old, grinned. "What do we call you now? You're not a judge anymore." Hargrove smiled, the first real smile he had in years. "Just Sam," he said. For the first time in decades, he wasn't hiding behind a gavel. And for the first time, he wasn't judging the world. He was helping fix it. And that was justice.